Colleagues, I'll call to order the 18th special meeting of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee. I'd like to reference the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. As necessary, the committee will recess at approximately 6:30 for victuals. With that, I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none. Nothing on the consent agenda or scheduled items. However, under items for direction, colleagues, you will find under the agenda, which includes addeds, 5 items. A through E, 2 we will receive as communications as request. We've had 2 delegation status requests, and we have a report from our staff with respect to the housing service review. Because there is a specific recommendation under A, I feel it's appropriate to hear from our delegations first. That would make sense to me. So we have 2 delegation statuses, and I look for a motion to receive request for delegation status from the Housing Development Corporation, represented by Board Member Dan Ross, moved by Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Salih. Any comments or questions? Then I'll.
Is it to approve the delegation?
It's to approve the delegation, yes. And I know there's some question of time frame in there as well. I wonder, we've got Councillor Hillier and Councillor Salih. Was there, I believe the request was, can you help me, clerk, on this, please?
Request for 15 minutes.
The request was for 15 minutes. Supported. Okay, so that would be, if I can include that with it, 15 minutes from the Housing Development Corporation. Any comments or questions, colleagues? Then let's turn to your attention to the screen as we vote.
Councillor Salih has indicated yay manually. Closing the vote and the motion carries 12-0.
Thank you very much. I'll call up Board Member Dan Ross for the Housing Development Corporation. Mr. Ross, 15 minutes, and I'll give you, if needed, a 60-second warning, which I've never done in all the times I've known you, so it will be interesting to do that.
We've never operated on mornings, Your Worship, so that likely won't change tonight. Thank you.
We'll start now, please, if you would.
Good. And thank you for indulging us. We think it's important. We bring some perspective tonight that we think will be valuable to the committee. And each of the board members is anxious that that perspective be heard. I will say that initially, this is not about boards tonight. This is about housing. When our board accepted this task, and they're all volunteer members, our commitment was to housing in London, and specifically to affordable housing in London, and that has not changed over the past 2.5 years. So my job here tonight is not to be defending boards. My job here tonight is to make sure we move in a very positive direction, focused on housing and focused on affordable housing in our future. I will say that we are somewhat disappointed with the KPMG report and the manner in which this has transpired, but we do fully recognize that housing is not operating in London the way it should, and it needs to change, and that the HDC must be part of that change. However, we also recognize that housing is a complicated subject. It has interrelationships, it has interdependencies, which must be both understood and, quite frankly, nurtured if we're going to do this successfully. I think it's also needs to be said that governance is a critical factor as we do move forward. And it may be that single governance is important in the short term, and it will certainly be that governance is important in the longer term. And I will speak to that in a few minutes, but once again, we're not here to dispute governance, we're here to find a solution that works for housing. Now, the HDC, the thing about the report that we heartily endorse and are quite frankly very happy about is even with all the discussion, it's made very clear that the HDC should continue. And we do believe, Your Worship and members of the committee, that that is extremely important. There's no question that the HDC in our mind will be a significant resource to the city. It will be a true enabler to the city as it moves forward to address issues in the housing continuum. So we can only thank you for that, and I'm sure on behalf of the people at the HDC, they look forward to working with the city in the future. I'm going to quickly address the KPMG report. As a board, we decided that there was little point in getting to a he said, she said with KPMG. In our mind, the city got, quite frankly, exactly what it asked for. It's a point-in-time analysis driven by numbers and driven by risk. As such, it is useful, and if it did nothing more than prompt and validate this review, it is indeed worthwhile. But, and this is a big but, it illustrates very little understanding of the housing continuum, the housing system, the role the HDC would play in that system, and the business case and business strategy developed to define that role, all of which have been presented to and approved by our principal shareholder, the City of London. So in the final analysis, what is the HDC? What this exercise has brought home critically to us is not only did KPMG not understand the business case and business strategy of the HDC and its place in the housing system, but that role is not fully understood by our partners in housing, and I suspect it's not understood by many councillors and indeed some staff. And if we look at what the Housing Development Corporation is to be, I think a good starting point is with the word development. And indeed, that's not a happy accident in the name of the Housing Development Corporation. If you look at our business case and our business strategy, again, all of which have been approved by the city, our functions are defined in that case and strategy and are clearly not just about numbers, which is really the gist of the KPMG report. Let me outline some of the core elements that we consider to be extremely important as we built the business case and the business strategy. Number one, we speak clearly to the need to work together, a single, coordinated housing system supported by all players, which can address both the short-term and the long-term housing needs. It needs to be supported by, if not single governance, a coordinated, unsiloed form of governance, which can speak to the principal issues of housing. I think while the HDC can react to short-term issues in housing, it's clear under our business case and our business strategy that we have a longer-term focus. And in order to fulfill that focus, we have to build foundation. And that foundation is based, number one, upon relationships, partnerships, and innovative approaches to housing, a rostering process with developers, which indeed is a pre-approval process which allows the HDC to incubate projects and shorten and increase the effectiveness of the RFP process. There is also a requirement for business case built into that relationship with developers. In other words, we don't proceed just by giving people money. We look at a business case, we work collaboratively with developers and other people involved to build a business case that is both credible and sustainable in the future. And it's one of the critical things, I think, that needs to be involved in the housing process. Also, we're looking to create on a long-term basis very real municipal housing stock, either city-owned or controlled through service agreements. It needs to be a municipally controlled inventory which deals with both affordable housing, but also by having that affordable housing, we're able to approach other people with expertise, other sources of financing, and layer on that affordable housing, special needs housing for the homeless, mental health and addiction, and other groups who may be in need. So it not only meets the need of affordable housing, but it respects the housing continuum and the needs of the people in our community. We also, on a long-term basis, look to expand the expertise and funding resources through the development of effective relationships and partnerships. You have short-term problems, but housing is a constant, and it's going to be with us for a long period of time, and it's going to challenge us for a long period of time. In order to deal with that, I think we need effective relationships and we need effective partnerships. Those relationships have to be with builders and developers. They have to be with not-for-profits in the industry. They have to be with the CMHC. They have to be with granting agencies. They have to be with charities. They have to be with the health sector and special service partners. And they have to be with our partners within the City of London, an example being the planning staff. And it all needs to happen in the context of our business case, and it all needs to help us build and be credible and sustainable over the long term in housing. And it's not just geared to numbers. The HDC, in less than 3 years out of the blocks, is committed to building sustainable value. And the relationships, the partnerships, the things that we've accomplished to date relate to that value. And they'll be enduring and they'll be sustainable as we move forward. We consider this a critical part of our mandate and of our business plan, the creation of long-term sustainable value in housing. It's not just about dollars. It's about structure. It's about partnership. It's about reaching out to the community and bringing all levels of expertise. It's about finding all levels of funding. And it's about making sure that we have a business case that endures and we're not just throwing money at a problem, we're actually creating value and we're creating long-term housing. You have short-term problems, there's no question about that. And the HDC will play a part in addressing short-term problems. But it is critically important that you build innovative long-term solutions for housing. You must create resources, you must create expertise, you must create financing, you must create inventory, and you must stay on plan. That's, in a word, why we are very pleased to see that you'll continue with the HDC, because they'll be a big part of that process. The HDC will be a fundamental and integral part of the long-term solution. If I paraphrase one of the letters that's before you tonight, we didn't get here quickly, and we won't get out of here quickly. The problems did not occur overnight, and they will not be solved overnight. If you add to this that the city just can't throw money at these problems, it makes it even more important that we concentrate on long-term value, we concentrate on long-term credibility, and that indeed is the importance of the HDC. Money may be limited to short-term solutions, and at times it'll be important that they be given to short-term solutions, be it in homelessness, be it in addiction and mental health, be it in other areas. But what we hope you will be able to rely on is a credible, sustainable long-term plan around affordable housing that constantly creates inventory that the city can use wisely in the future. So if I gave you our conclusions, number one, we absolutely support the continuance of the HDC, regardless of any decision on governance. They and their business case objectives are fundamental to building an effective housing system. These are talented young people. They're very good at what they do. They have a culture of commitment to the city and to the housing in the city. They have a process, I've already mentioned the rostering process, the business case process, that is, quite frankly, valid in context and will assist in moving us to the most enviable position with respect to housing. They have an accountability that is built into what they do, and they welcome that accountability. They learn from it, and they, quite frankly, grow from it. We ask that you don't make this about command and control. It has to be, in our mind, about strategic direction, defined outcomes, enablement, and accountability. And that's exactly what we believe you will get with the HDC. I will, however, put one caution forward. As a result of the report and some of the discussion of the report, there's, in our mind, reputational damage to the HDC that needs to be addressed. I think this can be addressed, and quite frankly, we believe it should be addressed. You can't blame anyone for that. You know, when the words ineffective or inefficient come out, they're obviously picked up quickly by the media. I can tell you that the HDC is anything but ineffective or inefficient. It is on its business plan, it's ahead of its business plan, it has a defined strategy, and it is, quite frankly, committed to that defined strategy. As I said earlier, it can't be just about numbers. It has to be about value. I can give you two quick examples that illustrate that point. In the addendum to the KPMG report, there was a discussion of market rental housing as opposed to affordable rental housing. And it was stated that market rental housing is not within the mandate of the HDC. And that, quite frankly, shows an absolute misunderstanding of the housing continuum. Not only is market rental housing within the mandate of the HDC, it is fundamental to successful affordable housing. Affordable housing just isn't about homelessness, and it just isn't about people who have housing needs. It's about young families, and it's about young people who are striving to get into the rental housing market. They do so, and may do so, because of affordable housing. However, those young people grow, their incomes increase, they may become two-income families, they may get new jobs, and eventually they will be able to move to a market housing regime. What that does is that frees up affordable housing. And it frees it up in the same building, in the same community, with the same neighbors, in the same school district, and in a situation where, quite frankly, nobody knows who's in affordable housing and nobody knows who's in market rental housing. It builds healthy communities. The lack of understanding that shows a fundamental lack of the housing continuum and how it has to work. Another example would be our current investigations with respect to surplus school sites. We're looking at those school sites not only to do affordable housing, and not only to do market rental housing, but also for parks and libraries and special health facilities that may be needed by the people that are in those things. Now, if I were KPMG, I might argue that 4 of those 5 things are not within our mandate, but they are precisely within the housing continuum that we're seeking to build in this community in conjunction with the city and conjunction with our partners in the housing continuum. So we can't say enough about how important it is to understand that continuum, to respect that continuum, and take advantage of it in every way we possibly can. The next element that I'm going to pick out of the KPMG report was risk, and it was said that we should try and eliminate risk. Well, my background is in healthcare, and I don't have to tell you how that has changed in the last several years. And the simple point, in fact, is I think whether you're in healthcare, whether you're in education, or whether you're in municipal governance, you can't do things the same anymore. It simply doesn't work. You have to look at risk, but the important thing is that you not necessarily try to eliminate it.
1 minute, please.
You need to understand it, you need to manage it, and you need to drive it toward outcome. And that's exactly what I'm asking the city to do. We need to drive toward outcome. When it comes to governance, you have short-term governance, you have long-term governance. Quite frankly, if you were to ask me which of the 3 choices I would make when the governance is set out, I would say none. I think in the short term, the best governance is the governance you have today. However, if it's necessary to build a housing system and to move that system to the right track, and if single governance or governance change is necessary to make that happen, you have our concurrence. And we will work with you to try and make that happen as effectively as we possibly can. Long-term governance, different story. It should be governed on the principles it's always governed on. People with expertise, people with experience, people with ability to communicate, people with ability to influence and connect. All the factors, and they're well known. We have them from when we formed our board, and we'd be happy to make those available to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. I think
I'll just summarize by saying one last thing in less than 30 seconds, but Your Worship, if I might. Don't misunderstand how important the HDC is to the housing spectrum. It is an enabler. It will make good things happen, and I think I can speak for our entire board in saying if we look back on this in 10 years' time, we'll be very happy with the outcome and the results that we will get from the HDC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Colleagues, any comments or questions for the delegation as presented? Councillor Squire.
I have to ask this question. You said that you thought possibly councillors did not understand the HDC, and I will admit that was not a comment I particularly enjoyed. Why don't councillors understand the HDC? Is it our fault, or is it something else?
I don't think it's anybody's fault. You know, I think a perfect solution would be for us to come here, spend a half hour with you and take you through a day in the life of the HDC, what our business case says, what our business strategy says, the relationships we're trying to build and why we're trying to build them, and what we see as the defined outcomes from those relationships. The reality, Councillor Squire, it's a complicated business. You know, when we started as directors 2.5 years ago, and you got to remember the HDC is only 2.5 years old, and it's come a long, long way in those 2.5 years, I can tell you that. But when we started 2.5 years ago, we didn't have a complete understanding of what affordable housing was. And there is a very, very definite learning curve. And I can tell you, if you go to the public, they have, most of them will equate it with homelessness or other housing that meets specific needs. That's not what affordable housing is. It's about creating housing stock that's available for any number of people, young families, young people, getting people close to transit, closer to where they work, all of the things that create healthy communities. And the important thing is that we leverage the partnerships that are available. You have very, very smart people working in homelessness and other areas. You've got letters from people who are extremely capable. The key is to draw the maximum advantage from all those people. Work in a coordinated system. Get rid of the silos, check the agendas at the door, concentrate on housing. And that's exactly what we've tried to do in HDC, and that's why the board, if it makes sense to move to a different kind of governance, if it's good for housing, and if it's good for what the HDC is trying to do, then we will concur and we will help you do that.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to Mr. Ross. I appreciate all of the information that you shared with us, and I think that everyone around this horseshoe certainly appreciates the work that all of the volunteers involved in the board have put into this organization, even if we may end up at the end of the day deciding that we need a different governance model. When you talk about the housing continuum, and you specifically mentioned the surplus school lands and acquisition, not only for housing, but also for looking at parks and other amenities in the neighborhood, would you not agree that in terms of synergies is really more than just a housing continuum, that it's a community planning issue, and that we might actually realize more planning efficiency if that is under the direction of city staff?
Mr. Ross.
I think, first of all, the thing I'd say, we work hand in glove with city staff. We have unbelievable support relationships with planning staff. So anything we do, we are very careful to make sure that we're working very, very closely with city staff. So it's not an either or equation. Our goal is to do things that maybe couldn't be as easily or as readily done by city staff. And that allows us perhaps to work with developers to do rostering. The one thing we're trying to do is, obviously money is an issue for everybody and everything we do. So if we can come up with relationships whereby developers bring equity to projects, but they bring that equity under a service agreement that lasts for 25, 35, or 50 years, we support them with a toolkit, be it DC relief, be it parkland relief, be it other things that we can do. And I'd say, by the by, that toolkit's only been developed in the last year, again, in conjunction with the HDC. Then I think what we are able to do is we're able to maybe push the boundaries, become more effective in what the final result looks like, and do things that are related to housing, but I don't differentiate healthy housing from healthy communities in the same way that I think housing is an integral part of healthcare. So our goal is to get as much housing stock as we can. Housing stock in the City of London is a municipal asset. Okay, it needs to be respected as a municipal asset. We need to create as much of it as we possibly can. We're not always going to tell people what to do with it. We want to create it as cheaply as we can. We want to make it affordable, but we also want to work with our partners in the community when it makes sense to layer on additional funding, to layer on additional expertise, and make it available for special needs and other purposes. So I wouldn't make the same distinction you make between continuum and housing, or between community and housing. I think they're very much one and the same.
Thank you, Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, thank you, Mr. Ross, for coming tonight. I just want to key in on a couple points that you'd said there. One was with respect to, I think, kind of stemming off Councillor Lewis's question. How would you recognize better alignment between the City of London's functions, London Middlesex community housing, and the HDC? At the beginning, in your statement, you talked about a coordinated, unsiloed system of governance. So it certainly recognizes the need for for tight integration between the three and the community at large. What are those things that help to accomplish that? I'll ask the second question now, and then just so that I get it in, what would be the indicators that council should be looking for that identify when there are issues with a program such as the HDC? You talked about how you were on track with what your business plan was. It differs from what KPMG's perspective is on this, but what would be those alarm bells that council should be watching for to say HDC is being effective or not?
Mr. Ross?
First of all, on the relationship side, you know, we have worked hard to build relationships with the city, and the city has some very capable people working in the housing area. We have one advantage in many ways over those people in the sense that our portfolio is much more directed than theirs is for the most part. You know, even though we are part of a larger housing continuum, our portfolio is affordable housing. And we're looking to build that on a sustainable, long-term basis for the most part by building relationships and doing other things. We can't help but notice with some of the people we deal with at the city is they have to deal with whatever is the imperative of the day at times. And we have the benefit of being perhaps able to adhere to a business strategy and a business plan on a day-to-day basis a little easier than they do. So as far as that relationship is concerned, I think that what we're allowed to do is go deeper for the most part, because there is a more defined business case and business strategy, and we just don't have as many things on our plate that we have to answer to on a day-to-day basis. It's not an issue of capability, it's just an issue of how you approach the task at hand. Having said that, the city is our one and only shareholder. You know, we exist because of the city. You are our shareholder. We report to you on an annual basis. We would like that to be more than 5 minutes, to be honest with you, for a little commercial, but because I think it needs to be for more than 5 minutes for something this important. Any member of city staff, quite frankly, any member of council is available to come to our meetings, and we'd like them to come more. But we too try. I know that Steve meets every week with his counterparts at the city. The city knows exactly what we're doing, exactly how we're trying to do it. And we will continue that process, whether or not there's independent governance or whether or not there isn't. So that's point number one. Point number two, you're going to have to help me with.
Councillor?
I'm aging here.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I recognized that I wanted to get in under the rules of our worship here, so get them both in there. The second one was, as councillors, what would be the indicators for us to be watching for to identify whether there were issues or not in terms of the functioning of the HDC?
I think the primary thing is what's already been identified. What we need is a comprehensive strategy for housing. Not 4 different strategies and 4 different silos. We need a comprehensive strategy for housing. And that doesn't mean that there aren't independent participants in the housing continuum. It means that there's communication and there's understanding as what we're trying to do, and we leverage from one another. We're constantly looking and striving for the best solution. So much like we've done in the HDC, you create a business case and you create a business strategy. You create the best people you can get, you create the best process that you can find, and then you enable it and you hold it accountable. You're constantly reviewing it with a view to make it better. And I would suggest that that would be a good formula to follow right across the whole housing spectrum, driven by the city, and quite frankly, led by the city. And the city, in my mind, could then enable key people with key expertise. We could go to sources of financing that we perhaps do not access now. We can go to people who are not presently partners, and we can look at what resources we need to bring to bear on housing to make it absolutely optimal against the challenges that we have. Because it's a challenge right now. Every community has those challenges. And we need to learn from other communities, and we need to learn from one another.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ross. I have a question, in fact, 2 questions. I've heard that we could, HDC can do a better job at getting more affordable units on the market, and that it's a slow process and it is complicated. I'd like to know how, moving forward, what we need to be doing here to be able to get more units out there. And if I may, just to follow up with a comment that you also said, which was, it's not about command and control. And if you can also expand on that just a little bit, so I understand what you meant there.
Mr. Ross?
Well, let me deal with the latter first, command and control. I think, having lived in the hospital world, having lived in the municipal world somewhat, we often in times of stress rely on command and control. In fact, we retreat to command and control. And at the very time that we should be enabling and empowering and demanding accountability and demanding innovation from people, we lapse back to numbers, to budgets, and to doing things, quite frankly, that don't allow us to be as innovative as we need to be to move in different directions. I don't think that we can solve our housing problems by just throwing money at it. I think we have to do better. We have to make better relationships. We have to leverage those relationships. You know, if the CMHC has funding, we've got to get every piece of that funding we can. If the government creates funding programs, we've got to get every piece of that funding that we can. If we're going to deal with an agency who's going to help deliver services within the housing we create, we've got to work with them to make sure that they get the funding support and every piece of it that they can. So what we've got to constantly do is work toward that best case scenario in the very best way we can. I don't think you get there with command and control. It tends to be too stifling. I think this is a time where you have to be empowering and enabling. You have to create defined outcomes and you have to create accountability, but you've got to let people stretch the envelope a bit, because we're not going to get where we need to go unless we're prepared to do that, okay? And as far as creating affordable housing is concerned, boy, would I ever love just to have $1 gazillion from you so I could throw it at housing, okay? That's not in the cards. So when we sat down and said, what can the HDC be and what should it be, we didn't go and we didn't ask for $1 gazillion. We have money because we feel that we have to ring the bell every year and create affordable housing. But if we're going to create the amounts of affordable housing that we need for the duration of time that we need, we've got to do it differently. We've got to build that foundation. That's why we've got to work with developers. We've got to work with government. We've got to work, obviously, with you. We've got to work with charities. We've got to work with other people to find sources by which we can fund. What we're looking to do is to create that long-term inventory, that capital stock owned by our community or controlled by our community, which not only will be available today, but will be more available 5 years from now and more available 10 years from now. And by governing that stock with accountability agreements, with service agreements, we have a commitment from the owner, maybe a private developer, and we've gained that commitment by providing certain incentives, or in some cases, certain financing, but we have a commitment to make that endure for 25, 35, 50 years. They cannot decide to back out of that program. So, you know, the more we roll those over, you know, the first one for 25, 35 years, the second one for 25, 35 years, that just simply builds the stock and builds the stock and builds the stock. And then if we manage that stock properly, as I mentioned, the progression from affordable housing or to rental housing, market rental housing, if we manage that stock, then you're constantly regenerating it and you're constantly making it available for other people. And it's more complex than that. I apologize for the brevity, but that will give you some idea where we're going. And that's why we felt we had to approach this on a long-term basis. It's building long-term value. It's not just about short-term dollars.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions for our delegation? Thank you, Mr.
Your
Ross. We appreciate your time and that of your delegation in preparation for this evening. We now have, colleagues, a request for delegation status from the London Middlesex Community Housing for 15 minutes. I will look for a motion to... They may have asked for 10, but I think in the spirit of parity, I will not cut them off at 10. I think 15 feels appropriate, if necessary. So thank you for that. But it will be 15 as necessary. Councillor Kayabaga, seconded by Councillor Pelosa. Comments or questions? Allowing the delegation 15 minutes. If not, then I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Counselor Salee? Closing the vote, the motion carries 13-0.
Thank you. I'll invite the representatives of London Bell 6 Community Housing. I'm not sure whom is going to be speaking, so I'll ask as they make their way down to introduce themselves. And we will only begin as you're ready to begin. Thank you. So as we ask the LMCH to come forward with their presentation, I'll remind them we have 15 minutes, not 10, and I will give, if needed, I will give 60 seconds notice before the end of the presentation. I'll ask folks who are speaking to introduce themselves as we go forward. And away we go.
Mayor Holder and committee members, thank you for receiving our delegation this afternoon. My name is Josh Brown, and I am the CEO of LMCH. I'm also joined here with our board chair, Sean Quigley, our vice chair, Alena Lanista, past and current board members, senior staff, and other members of staff in the gallery. Today, I want to communicate two key messages to council. Addressing housing needs in our community and at LMCH demands leadership, knowing that we can only solve these problems together. And second, LMCH has been making progress and has a clear path forward for real change. 3 years ago, after having worked in civic administration and housing for nearly 15 years, I put my hand up to take the lead of LMCH because I believe that public housing can and should be used as the foundation for real change and positive impact for our tenants and community. At that time, I knew that leadership meant taking a very underfunded, undervalued, and chronically under-led organization that lacked councils and civic administration's trust and credibility. Working at LMCH has been the most challenging, humbling, and proud work of my career, but my vision for public housing and the community remains unchanged. We worked hard to serve our tenants in an impossible equation, deeply flawed business model, where the work far surpasses the resources to build that trust and credibility. As you can see, our constraints are real and have real impact on our operations, including vacancy rates and turnaround time. This has been validated most recently by both PwC and KPMG. Rebuilding an organization is difficult. It's messy. It doesn't happen overnight. But we have made significant progress with the support of both the previous council and this council, who have signaled to the community that supporting tenants matters and endorsing our strategic plan and approving a housing-first approach for London. Moving from simply being a landlord to a housing provider that cares also aligns with our shareholder agreement that defines responsibilities and accountabilities relating to both our housing stock and tenant support. We have maximized the resources we do have and improved processes. These have included optimization of technology, developing key performance indicators, implementing a project management system, vacancy and work order process improvements, setting care quality standards, and others on the slides, and also that we've been reported to in the board of the past 3 years. In addition, 86% of our strategic objectives are done or on track to be completed. The path forward does not paint a pretty picture, but it is a real picture that requires real significant investment if we want to achieve new outcomes and better ones. The need for us on the next year multi-year budget is $71.4 million in capital and $69.6 million in operating. These figures are detailed in our written submission and will address the critical gaps in our service, capacity, and infrastructure supported by our first ever asset management plan, which I have a copy with me. The path forward can deliver real outcomes, including housing stability, which is the primary focus of the city's new housing and homelessness plan. Council now has the opportunity to clearly set the direction and outcomes our city needs and can only achieve together. But let me be clear. Without significant investment, no matter the governance structure, no matter the mandate or focus, no matter the leader, no matter how many audits we complete, no matter how many lean processes we implement or policies written, we will not achieve better results or solve this housing crisis together. However, we will continue to put tenants first, serve our communities with every resource at our disposal to make a difference. Before I conclude and let Sean allow you to address the committee, I will briefly discuss vacancies directly. Vacancy has been an issue discussed and reported on by LMCH since devolution. We have taken responsibility for the vacancy issue before the Housing Services Review was considered, and we have a plan with the city's support that will see our vacancy rate decline and reduce to 2% by the end of 2019. Vacancy rate and turnaround days are impacted by things that we control directly and things that we don't. Specifically, the number of move-outs, the notice period, the state of the unit, competing resource demands and capacity, pests, waitlist priorities and policy, provincial legislation, first and last month's rent, and current living conditions of the applicants. The work is not easy or simple, but we need to be what the community needs, and we recognize that we cannot do it alone. That means that we understand having more than 150 units vacant at any given time while our city is facing a housing crisis is not acceptable. As for each person who moves into it, it means the world to them to have a home. However, filling every unit today or tomorrow will affect less than 0.5% of those in need of housing on the wait list. Also, filling a unit also means making difficult decisions between the provision of providing tenant support services that would otherwise possibly lead to eviction and homelessness. Today, I want to publicly thank Council, the city, the board, and most importantly, our staff for the hard work and commitment in working together to address this problem head on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Quigley?
Thank you, Your Worship. We want to thank Council for the opportunity to speak today, and with our board chair, board vice chair, Alena Lanista. And I also want to recognize and thank our current and former board members who are here and the staff who have showed up to support us, as well as community partners. We've come to you today to discuss the KPMG audit report, its findings, and to share with you details stated in the report we find ourselves challenged with. Our board has serious concerns regarding comments that some members did not have the skill sets required to focus on core business. At no time were we, as board members, requested to provide qualifications or resume details. For Council's benefit and understanding, as you appointed us, our board consists of experts in law, housing engineering, human resources, corporate governance, procurement and finance, and most importantly, persons with lived experience, both past and current. We are at a loss to understand what skill sets KPMG found lacking. Council will also understand that our board is deeply saddened. We were not consulted by city staff as a matter of courtesy prior to the public release of this report, especially given its very serious allocations. These actions have left our board shocked and saddened, especially considering the many hours we have volunteered on behalf of Council and in good faith. This current vacancy issue Josh just spoke about was brought to our attention in January through our CEO, at which time the board directed him to determine the cause and to provide a detailed plan and to fix the issue. So Council is aware, this January, LMCH saw 59 units vacated, the largest number of vacancies in a single month in 5 years. This created a knock-on effect that raised our vacancy rates. Since April of this year, and through the direction of our board, LMCH staff have restored, as of August 31st, 216 units. We have moved into our units in the same time period, 176 families and individuals. We have housed and restored more people in units than any other housing organization in the city. Council will further understand our board's sadness despite the fact that LMHC staff will, under this board's governance, have achieved by the end of December a record low vacancy of 2%. This, despite our staff seeing a number of work orders go from 14,000 last year to more than 20,000 this year, that we have this recommendation. There are two more points we would make as a board. First, it has come to the board's attention that a confidential in-camera report was made to Council regarding, at least in part, LMCH. We do not know, as is correct, the details of the meeting. But the Board of LMCH would ask that we be consulted, shared that report in camera by council or members of council, so we can respond to those criticisms openly and fairly, and so council is reassured. As you have heard, we've given you our request for $69 million for operating dollars and more than $70 million for early capital, outside of the multi-year budget process. This request is detailed and costed and results from council's real need to know at this time. In the package we sent to council, our board has offered its own recommendations. We are requesting the council add a second member of council to our board, as we asked for recently, as well as more than a year ago. We have also asked over the past, requested another board member be added based on a skill matrix we provided, and are absolutely willing to replace this past request with a member of city staff. Unlike boards such as London Hydro, whose profit allows them to be resourced by much more staff than LMCH, and they have a paid board, our board of volunteers, and if LMCH were resourced as London Hydro, then we could expect radically different returns. Sadly, LMCH is the lowest funding housing authority in Ontario by 30%. We would also ask council to increase the number of meetings between LMCH and council. 5 minutes, a few times a year, it's much too little a time. Council will understand we are concerned staff has made recommendations to remove the board with no plan on how to move forward, no budget attached to that plan, no plan for the lived experience of our tenants, and no clear direction on when that plan would begin. In comparison, our board is ready with a revitalization plan, asset management plan, and critically a plan to engage with the people who live in LMCH housing. If council chooses to adopt the recommendation put forward by staff at this time, our board is very concerned that in a year from now, we will see the ball has not moved an inch, regardless of the decision that council makes today. We would ask council to judge our work fairly and with respect, and most importantly, to keep the needs of our tenants firmly in mind when determining LMCH's future. We thank council for its attentiveness and consideration, and my vice chair would like to speak to you about lived experience.
Ms. Lanista.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. If I may, just for a moment, switch hats. As most of you know, aside from being a member of this board, I am also an advocate for persons with lived and lived experience in this city. I sit on several tables in this capacity, as well consult the work with the Canadian National Lived Experience Advisory Council. I have spoken to many organizations and groups. I share, when I speak, I proudly share the work being done by our city, this council, and I often speak of this housing board in particular as an example of the work that you're doing, the good work that you're doing in regards to lived and lived experience and the inclusion of. I speak in detail of our London for All plan and the recommendations put forth, as well as the incredible work done by our former mayor and the poverty panel he created. Recommendation 27 from the systems change category is as follows. To engage people with lived and lived experience in democratic processes and institutions. True system change requires strategies that increase participation of people with lived and living experience with poverty in democratic processes and institutions so that they can help shape the future of this community. Strategies can focus on increasing voter registration, voter turnout, participation in public meetings, and most importantly, opportunities on boards. I will also point out to the very first principle listed for the implementation body, and that is that people with lived experience with poverty are included as key decision makers at every level. Folks are astounded when I share with them the work that's been done in my city, and often I and my colleague and fellow housing board member Deb Peckham are called upon to share our experiences. We will proudly be representing London this coming November at the upcoming Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness National Conference in Edmonton, and have been asked to act as presenters, sharing the importance of inclusion of lived and lived experience persons in all decision-making processes and what is being done in London in regards to. Mayor Holder, councillors, you have been doing this right. This housing board is a great example of how to. It's not perfect. Heck, I'd like to see at least 25% inclusion. And as I've requested to you on more than one occasion, and especially to each of you individually, this should include persons with both lived experience, past and current tenants. This is direct inclusion. This is not you knowing someone that you can call and check in with every once in a while. The days of lining us up at the front of the room and giving us permission to speak or tapping us when it's our turn is done. This is an insult to both our value and our worth. We are not tokens. We are important and we matter. I
hate to
ask
tell
that
you
you to
it's
keep
60
this
seconds based
and the
on
work
that.
that you've done to date at the top of your priority list when making decisions regarding any changes to this board and who sits at the decision-making level. Nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all three of our presenters and open up to any questions from colleagues to the delegation. Councilor Van Meerberg.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering, have you been reaching out? I've been approached by a few constituents who are retired tradespeople in the building industry, and they're saying there are hundreds of retired skilled tradespeople who would love to contribute their time and talent voluntarily to help you get these places up and running and back onto the market. Have you thought of things like that, or have you looked into that type of approach?
Mr. Brown?
Through the chair, absolutely. One of our core values for our organization is about collaboration, recognizing that we can't do this alone. We are challenged within our current environment. We work within a unionized environment, so there is some real challenges there. But partnership is something that we continue to look at. But realizing this, in the environment of constrained resources, when we're asked to put a tenant need, and whether it's a social need or support need, or whether it's fixing an elevator versus fixing a unit, I'm gonna pick a tenant every time. But saying that, partnership is one of those key things we would love to look at. But we do have resourcing needs to actually do that work. Have we reached out? Absolutely. We've reached out through the city. Most recently, we've had a conversation with the city service, housing services, about a partnership with Fanshawe to do something just like that. So we would be absolutely open to looking at more partnerships to help us deliver better housing services, fix our stock, and support our tenants. Absolutely.
Thank you. Councilor Van Meerberg.
Thank you for that. Just to be clear, so this type of offer, this model that they're speaking of, is that in the realm of reality for your organization? Given that you mentioned about unions, is that a block?
Mr. Brown?
It is a block, but I don't think it's a block that's necessarily can overcome. We've had very good, and we've improved those relationships with the union. They recognize the need. They recognize the difficulty on their tenants and their members, their members in terms of delivering service to some of the most vulnerable Londoners day in and day out. So I think there's an absolute desire on both the organization, on the board, on management, and the union to actually work together to try and do something innovative.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions for our guests? Councilor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, thank you for the presentations and the information. Having read through the report and your submissions as well, one of the things I found a bit disjointed between the two was a question of I guess your peers and benchmarking against other peers within the province. The notes in the KPMG report said that they'd had difficulty in doing so. I imagine that that as an entity, you probably compare yourself against peers fairly often. Who would you consider to be the peers? Where would you see yourself? I think you'd mentioned about 30% less funding than the next closest, but also what resources are had there. I guess what would be those benchmarks that you would use to compare against your peers, and who would those peer group be?
Mr. Brown?
Yep, through the chair. Specifically to the question about our peers, so we look to municipalities, Ottawa, Hamilton, Windsor, Toronto to some degree, recognizing they have significant challenges. Absolutely, we were challenged with the data and how that came out. One of the things that we've talked about as an organization is to say, council, and fully respecting council's decision in terms of the governance, and I would support what you heard from the Housing Development Corporation as well. All we're looking for is to make sure that council makes informed decisions. So we have put forward those concerns in our written submission. Hopefully you had a chance to go through those. It's a continuing issue across the province. We don't have a data system that compares us because we do things so differently. For example, Windsor has a municipal nonprofit. They have market rent. And what the concern was specifically to the data, that wasn't considered in terms of the context in which it was brought forward. Like I said, that being said, we recognize that council has the ability to make whatever decision they choose in terms of the governance. Our role, and my role, was to make sure that that decision was well-informed and based on solid data.
Councillor Turner?
Thank you, through your worship. Just in the interest of time, I'll ask a quick one. Same question I asked the HDC. What are those benchmarks we should be looking for? The obvious one, obviously, as was the focus and the lightning rod in the KPMG report, was unit turnover and vacancies. But I'd imagine there are key performance indicators that you use on a regular basis that have different importance and priorities for you.
Mr. Brown?
Through the chair, very good question. And it's one of the things that I was tasked for. With a new strategic plan, with a new vision, we said as a board, how do you measure that? And we looked at that and we established a system to do that. And that system came to a point that was provided in your package. I think it's the last page on the package. So it outlines very, very clearly what is our strategic plan, what is our objectives, and within those objectives, what are we going to measure? We do have data issues. We do have work to do, absolutely. I'm not standing up here and saying we have this all right. This is hard work. It's hard work on the board, it's hard work on staff. You know, and to speak personally about this, it's a difficult thing to feel like you're completely failing. To talk to tenants who walked into an elevator the wrong time with the wrong person and won't walk again. And that's one example. And it's real. And it's day in, it's day out. And I know you're all failing, or not failing, feeling like you're failing. And this is tough. This is tough work. And we're only going to be as good as we are when we come together. So I appreciate the report. I appreciate what it said in terms of the constrained resources in which we operate under. We've been saying that for 3 years. I stood up here 2.5 years ago and we raised our hand and we said we had an issue, a big one. And what we said, we didn't point the finger at council, we didn't point the finger at the city, we didn't point the finger at the province. We said we inherited it. That's life. What I said is that we'll take accountability and responsibility for it and trying to move it forward. And we would come back with a plan, multiple plans, and I've heard this, an asset management strategy of which we developed internally because we recognize that we don't have unlimited resources and we couldn't go out and we couldn't spend $300,000 on consulting fees to do this work. We know our stuff. We just want the ability to do the work and make the impact that I came here to do, that staff came here to do, and that the board came here to do. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Mr. Squire.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions. First of all, and these may seem basic, could someone tell me what a social procurement policy is, first of all? And secondly, I just want to understand that you rent apartments to people. Are you providing, and I'm just asking this because I want to know, are you providing something extra to people? Do people get something in terms of counseling, assistance with addictions, assistance with mental illness at your facilities, or do you view yourself as providing an apartment or unit only?
Mr. Quigley.
Through the chair, and thank you so much for that really great question, Councillor Squire. So social procurement, to start with, is where we engage with other agencies and nonprofits who have specifically hired people and work with people who are vulnerable, from vulnerable populations, and they produce products and services. And social procurement says that we will use that methodology when it's appropriate to hire those services. I know that downtown, Goodwill Industries is an example of that with this, and their cleaning industries, right? The second part of it, when it comes to specifically around mental health, I'll just say one thing, that we have a lot of partners, and I'm going to let my vice chair and co-leader, Ms. Easton, speak to it.
Thank you. At each of our sites, we have what are titled community support workers. These workers are available to our tenants on a daily basis. Most sites have them daily. Some have them a couple of times a week for assistance with some of their basic needs, whether it's help with, you know, if the rent is getting behind, or if they need communications to other agencies or other organizations. These support workers, they're not, we're not funded for these support workers, but we have them in place because we recognize there's a need with our tenants.
Thank you. Other comments or questions to our guests? Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the presenters. And I just want to thank you for the presentation. I did sit on the board for the past 4 years, and I'm very familiar with the hard work and compassion that the board members give to the board. And I do see former board members and chairs in the gallery too. And I know this is important. It's a conversation I think that we need to have here for sure. And I just want to thank everyone for being here and having this conversation. I know as we move forward with this meeting, we are going to be dealing with some options and having those discussions. And one of the things I learned being on the board is the importance of having flexibility in the stakeholder agreement. I think we've already sort of dealt with that in the previous committee meeting, but I just want to get back to Councillor Van Meerbergen's questions about the flexibility and the importance of how we move forward and the difficulties that LMCH has been experiencing. There are many, many challenges. And it's something that I've learned to understand. And one of the things I was concerned about in being on the board is the tendency, the vacancy of every month. You know, that's a question that we need to ask, and being the stakeholder, we need to understand and get that number as low as possible. So my question, I guess, is about, we do have the vacancy chart in front of us here, moving forward, how that is going to come about, and if you can give a little bit more details, what the plans are there.
Thank you, and through the chair, we laid out that plan and we provided that to council, and we've given 2 updates. Basically, it is a resource and a capacity issue. KPMG was clear that we do have constrained resources, and those resources impact our ability to fix units. Through the city's support and help, and we outlaid the cost for that was about $500,000 to get those units and get that vacancy rate down to 2%. We believe we can hit those targets. But I will also state that if we don't get and continue with that level of funding, we won't be able to maintain 2%.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Hopkins, do you have a follow-up? All right, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. And I first want to say, particularly to Mr. Brown, thank you for making the time to meet with me and answer some of the questions I had leading up to tonight's meeting. I appreciate that, and I know that others have reached out as well to offer their expertise. It is appreciated. Something that just came up in my mind as a result of Councillor Squire's question with regard to the support workers. And the reason I'm asking this is because I noted in the slides, we have all these hundreds of work orders and 1 maintenance and repair person. So if the support workers, if you're not receiving funding for those support workers, how are they being paid? And where are we resourcing those from, as opposed to not being able to resource more maintenance and repair contractors?
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I just want to clarify the funding piece. That's where we put the funding. If you refer to the slide, I just go back, and we have 1 community relations worker for every 550 tenants. If you compare that to, I think, the current caseload, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not up to speed with that, that is probably 110 to 120 per caseworker in terms of delivering Ontario Works. So hopefully that puts it in perspective in terms of the challenges that we have to respond to the need, the daily need, and typically we're not doing that work, the real work of support or case management. We're putting out fires. We're trying to settle disputes between neighbors. We're following up on arrears, those types of things. So I would not consider this by any means real support that tenants need. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. I think it might be helpful, Mr. Brown, to the chair, if you could just expand on what exactly this is showing, because I think you're trying to show the ratio between the staff and the volume of things, like 240 units for each maintenance and repair person. So perhaps you just clarify that.
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, through the chair, that is correct. Yep.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, may I thank Mr. Quigley.
Thank you for your forbearance, Your Worship. Just through the chair to Councillor Lewis, I just want you to understand that often our caseworkers, are the folks who work with the most challenge, are referring people, and we're doing that because of the huge amount of damage that often happens to our units. So in the end, we save money that way. I just wanted to make sure you understood that. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you for that clarification. Seeing no other comments, I'd like to thank the delegation from the London Middlesex Community Housing and for your presentation as well, and to colleagues for your questions and answers. We have under additional items D and E, two letters, one from Dia Stolfi, the Director of Supportive Housing Services, Canadian Mental Health Association, Middlesex, as well as from Sister Jay Atkinson, board member of the London Poverty Research Center at King's, chair of the London Affordable Housing Foundation. I'd accept a motion to receive these letters. Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Kayabaga. Let's turn our attention to the screen as we vote to accept them.
Councillor Van Meerbury. Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-0.
Thanks very much, and colleagues, appreciate your accommodation as we now will deal with the City of London Housing Service Review Proposed Action Plan Update. You'll note that we moved that to the end so that we could properly hear the delegations as it relates specifically to this, and I wonder if I could ask Ms. Dittersbeer to take us through that, please. Oh, I think we need a motion to, well, let's just do it then. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through the chair. On August 27th, Council received the Housing Services Review Report and directed staff to develop an action plan to identify actions that would need to be taken to address it. Council also directed that actions be taken to immediately address vacancy concerns within London and Middlesex community housing stock, and to examine the development of affordable housing concurrently being delivered on the city's behalf by the Housing Development Corporation. The report before you this afternoon provides the context for the approach that has been developed to address Council's directions, as well as identifies the list of immediate, medium, and longer-term actions. In crafting a plan moving forward, Civic Administration met with the boards of directors and senior staff of both the HDC and the LMCH to discuss the housing services review and to share possible options for moving forward. Both organizations sought, as you've heard today, additional information regarding the original report, and clarifying information has been provided to both organizations over the last week. We do acknowledge the work of the individuals on both boards and their senior staff and all staff. Through their commitment, they have consistently demonstrated a desire to work together to address housing challenges in this community. As the report indicates, and as you hear from Council, from community stakeholders and citizens, the provision of safe, affordable, accessible housing is important in our community. It's essential. We are struggling. We are struggling in our community to ensure that housing is available for all with increased need and a growing challenge resulting from the lack of housing affordability. We often hear that we aren't doing enough, we must do more, and that what we are doing well isn't well understood, or could be understood, or should be understood. The review indicated that we need to address any unit vacancies in LMCH's housing stock, determine how best to create new housing, and consider how to realign existing resources to maximize outcomes. But we also need to keep the existing housing system stable while we work to address concerns and reduce confusion. It's for these reasons, delivering on Council's direction, that Civic Administration is recommending implementing a coordinated, multi-phased approach to address concerns, to tackle broader community issues, and to address future financial requirements. We are recommending that the city assume governance oversight for all elements of the city-led and city-supported housing and homeless prevention system, at least for the interim, to begin to address the challenges that have been identified and to create increased collaboration and alignment. This would include taking a more direct role in the governance of LMCH and HDC. This recommendation is about how the city moves forward, how we move forward to deliver services that will meet the evolving housing needs in our community. Is about looking ahead and making sure that the structure and the activities support the needs of this community in the future. The organizational entities remain in place and continue to operate as is in the interim, so as to ensure the provision of the needed services in our community, including to our LMCH tenants and to those in our community who are actively currently involved in affordable housing development. With respect to governance, we've put forward 3 options. One of being all council members acting as the board for both organizations, 2 boards. A second option is a smaller group of council members or a standing committee could act as the board. Again, there are 2 boards, 2 organizations. The third option and the preferred option in the report is the appointment of a member of civic administration to act as the boards. At Council's direction, we have delivered options and an action plan that intends to address the challenges identified in the third-party review. We recognize this is a challenging time, and yet it is an important activity for us to be involved in. It is recognized, though, that despite recommendations that have been brought forward, Council can and will make different decisions. Regardless of the decisions made by Council, we will endeavor to implement Council's decision as expeditiously as possible. I thank you for the opportunity to provide this information. I know that Ms. Barbone and I are happy to answer any questions that you have with respect to the report.
Thank you, Ms. Daderspear. I'll turn to colleagues. Any comments or questions to staff? Councilor Morgan.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Card, actually. Given that we're changing structures to corporations that we're the sole shareholder of, are there any concerns from your standpoint on any of the options listed above with the way that boards are supposed to normally operate?
Mr. Card?
No, Your Worship, I'm not. There will be some adjustments required. Each of the corporations is a business corporation. It has articles of incorporation that deal with a number of directors, and we have to make adjustments to those. There's also a shareholders declaration in each case that talks about how the businesses will operate, and we'll have to come forward with recommendations to you for changes to those, but these things can be done.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Ms. Hopkins? Councillor Hopkins, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just following up on Councillor Morgan's question to Mr. Card, I know on the LMCH board that we have a councillor from Middlesex County. Would that be also required moving forward?
Mr. Card?
I believe the understanding with Middlesex County, and we're the service manager, but I believe the understanding is there will be representation. I looked at the existing articles of incorporation, and I see that originally there was a member from Middlesex County, and I imagine the intention is that that would continue. But again, these are things up to the council. We will make the adjustments necessary as required and confer with our colleagues in Middlesex County to ensure that they're fully informed of the intentions of our council.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Councillor Van Meerbergen.
I've had the opportunity to speak with former members of the board, London Housing. And it seems that there's been an ongoing tug of war, and there's quite a history of this, between, as we've heard earlier, of the social procurement versus the hard services procurement. And it's coming out of one budget. And quite often, the social procurement takes money that should be allocated for the hard services, for the maintenance, for the ongoing upkeep. It almost begs the question that as we move forward, that maybe we look towards a model where there's separated budget, one for maintenance, the other for social procurement, and have a board overseeing both. So we don't get this bleeding effect where there isn't enough or aren't enough resources for the physical upkeep for things like boilers, heating, the general physical bricks and mortar of these units. And I think there may be some merit to that, and I just put that out there to all of us, but particularly staff, that as we go forward, we maybe keep this in mind as something that perhaps we move towards.
Thank you. I didn't hear a question in there. What I'd like to do is perhaps I'd like to make a comment and ask Councillor Morgan, please, to take the chair.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to acknowledge all of the reports and delegations that we've received and the amount of work that's been put into all the considerations that we're reviewing. I appreciate the information Council's been presented from KPMG, HDC, LMCH, and certainly city staff about the issue. The work to review our current housing situation and to come to ultimately these recommendations is extensive. As part of Council's strategic plan, we identified as a key area of focus leading in public service. If we're committed to that, we also have to be committed to asking hard questions and at times making difficult but necessary decisions. I believe this is one of those times. Council has asked for and received third-party feedback, information, and advice. Today, we are making a decision about how to act on that. We all appreciate and know that housing in our community is a critical issue. This process is necessary. It has shed light on our challenges and where we have problems. It's also shed light on the options before us to address those challenges. So as we contemplate the direction we want to take to move forward, it's critical we recognize there are dedicated, hardworking people committed to this issue. This includes the individual board members of the LMCH and HDC who have been committed to the delivery of housing in our community. We recognize their skills, passion, and we say thank you to them for their volunteer efforts. That is sincerely appreciated. We've come to a point where this is where the issues and challenges that are impeding the delivery of housing in our community must be addressed. These challenges differ between the organizations, but collectively they need a point for action. And while that action may be difficult, it needs to be immediate. So while my council colleagues may not all agree on how we address the issue moving forward, I believe we all share a resolve to address our housing challenges. I'm confident that we're unified in our commitment to address issues of homelessness, housing access, affordability, safety, and security of our existing options. For that reason, Mr. Chair and to colleagues, I'm moving the recommendation and the motion as presented by staff, which includes option 3 as the preferred option.
Okay, is there a seconder for the mayor's motion? Councillor Lewis. I'll start a speaker's list on the staff recommendation, including option 3. Councillor Squire.
This may not be the last time I talk, but as usual, I decide I've got to open my mouth first. You know, I think, through you, Mr. Chair, I think the first thing that this has brought an awareness to, and I hope it's finally brought an awareness to, is that delivering affordable housing is not an easy matter. Day after day, I receive emails, tweets, notes saying, please just get to that affordable housing issue and solve it, would you? You know, and get it done maybe within the next year. if you got time. We all have to know that that's not the way this works. This is really very difficult work. Every person who is homeless or has difficulty with housing has a different story to tell, has a different set of challenges. I see it every day in my work working with mentally ill people. Last week I represented a 74-year-old man who has money but was evicted from his apartment by a bunch of squatters who moved into his apartment and threw him out on the street. Who would have imagined that that would happen in London, Ontario, but it did. So I think that the one thing that I know is this is a very complicated and long-term issue that we are not going to solve overnight. I came to this meeting completely undecided because I have all kinds of concerns about all of the different approaches we're taking. But I know one thing, we have done a terrible job of communicating what affordable housing and homelessness means and what it is. For instance, I have to say that today, I seem to be learning for the first time that the Housing Development Corporation is not really a development corporation. It's more, it's an advisory investment corporation, creating new systems, new ways for people to work together to create affordable housing. I thought it was a development corporation, so shame on me. I would appreciate it. I've been sort of going under a misapprehension for some period of time, although I've received hints of this from the CEO of the Housing Development Corporation. So I think people should, at least I'm learning that. But I'm still undecided, and I'm still really concerned that the option that we're going forward with is not going to solve this problem. We're just moving the chairs on the dance floor, and I'm not sure we're genuinely solving anything. And as counselors, we're in a really difficult position. These are two bodies we rely on. The only good thing, the one good thing I've learned today is that the London Middlesex Community Housing wants a 17% increase in operating expenses. So think about that. LTC just passed a 15% increase in a desire for operating expenses. Think about that. There is an issue there, which is where are we going to put our money? Where are we going to invest our money? Because we don't have the money to do these kinds of things. So I'm going to continue to listen to discussion, but I remain unconvinced that there has indeed been a solution presented to this problem of affordable housing. I actually have experience in this area. I was the chair of the board of Habitat for Humanity. And we built houses for people, and I know how difficult it was. But I know the one thing they always said to me was, when I said, well, do you work with the city? And you say, oh, the bureaucracy, it kills us. We can't get anything done. And I want to say this, and it's not criticism. I've gone to a lot of meetings about housing with the Housing Development Corporation, with our staff, and with London Middlesex Community Housing. I always leave those meetings confused about what everybody does, about where they get their money, what they're doing. And I can tell you, when I bring people in to talk about housing at the city or somewhere else, those people also leave completely confused, and they've said it to me. They say to me, we didn't understand what that meeting was about, and we don't understand how to move this forward. So that's where I am right now, and it's very difficult.
Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Councillor Squire, for those comments about not sure if we're just rearranging chairs, if there's a solution here, because I don't think what's before us tonight is a solution. I think what's before us tonight is a first step in tackling a problem that we heard from both of the agencies involved. The HDC said, you know, they would concur with a single governance model. If we have to change models, that's what they would prefer to see. LMCH, the first couple of sentences we heard were, there's a flawed business model here. And how we start to tackle those issues starts with changing the governance structure, breaking down silos, and having one person who's accountable to us as the shareholder, to the citizens of London as a shareholder, one person who's going to coordinate and start to make some headway on some of these things. The vacancy rate has captured people's imaginations, but the vacancy rate is only one issue. It's the tip of the iceberg. There are other things that are very real factors in affordable and geared to income housing in this city. And I hear affordable housing mentioned all the time. I don't hear geared to income mentioned enough, because frankly, that's where our biggest gap is right now. That's why we have a waiting list as long as we have, because we don't have the supply there. And we do have a flawed business model where we have 50-year-old assets that we can't remortgage to pay for the repairs and revitalization. I get that. I really do. And I want to say, like, this is going to be a hard decision to make. Marcy Easton Allen is somebody I consider a friend. And I know that she's not alone in the board members at LMCH who've really poured their heart and soul into the work that they're trying to do. I know that staff at LMCH are doing the very best with the limited resources that they have. I get it. I also, when I look at a KPMG report and hear that 87% of the unit repairs of the sample that they pulled didn't have a level of repair order assigned to it, I see a structural problem. And I absolutely know that Mr. Brown is speaking with his heart when he says he wants to pick that tenant every time. Sometimes, though, we have to strike that balance, because picking that tenant might mean leaving somebody sleeping outside that night. So we don't have a solution that's going to fix housing in this city, folks. All we are talking about is an interim step here in terms of the governance structure to start turning the ship around and to start steering it in what we hope is the right direction, so that a year from now, we can see some progress being made. And I absolutely see this as an interim step, because one person, we will lose out on the lived experience that was highlighted as being so very important with only one person. But I don't think that one person is going to ignore the advice and the input from the tenants, past and present. And I think that in the long term, when we get back to reviewing where we go past this interim governance step, we absolutely need to make sure that current tenants are part of the voice, part of the decision-making process. But for me right now, this step, this first step in fixing housing, and yes, it is a bit of a retreat into command and control. I don't disagree with that. But in this case, it's a retreat because we're losing the battle. The wait lists are getting longer. The repair expenses are getting more costly. We can't possibly absorb a 17% operating budget increase for housing and a 15% budget increase for transit, and the other increases that will no doubt be asked from other boards and commissions, and still keep people who are actually not that far from not being able to stay in their homes if we slap those costs onto property tax hikes. So we have to strike that balance. So colleagues, I'm gonna urge you to support this motion from the mayor, keeping in mind that this is an interim step. Our work on this file is only beginning, and we've got a long way to go, but we have to start somewhere.
Thank you. Councillor Salee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of questions through you to staff, if that's okay. So I guess my first question is, what is interim? And, you know, I know that might be hard to answer that question, but how long is that? And will it ever become permanent, I guess? And why, I know you gave us three options, but why the third one do you propose over having elected officials? Part of that is a question I have. And again, my questions aren't judging where I'm landing on supporting or not supporting this. I just have one of those clarifying questions, because I have always been one of the people who've wanted more counselors on boards, as you've seen in past motions with Arts Council all the way to the police board.
Ms. Dejersper.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. The report identifies immediate, medium, and long-term actions. I would say to you that the immediate and the mid-term actions are those that will happen when the board is either managed by council or a representative of civic administration. Those actions include getting our business in shape at all four parts of the housing continuum, both in LMCH and HDC, but also in housing prevention, or housing homelessness prevention division and also our housing services division. The midterm actions that start in January to go through to December of 2020 look at issues around administration of services, service delivery models, new programs, policy development, community engagement. They also speak to us looking at governance structures. So it's our intention at this point in time to have those interim boards in place until we get that work finished. It could happen sooner than the end of 2020, and we're hoping for that, but it will happen sometime between January to December of 2020. So that I would see that the interim board would probably be in place for 16 to 18 months at this point in time. Again, I recognize that there's certainly a request to ensure that we have lived and living experience in that discussion, and we would look to see how we would do that as moving that forward as well.
Councillor Salee?
And just the second part of my question, which is why the third option versus I'm an elected official? Thank you, through the chair.
Ms. Davisbeer?
Thank you and apologies. In terms of providing you with options for consideration, we acknowledge that governance structures are best managed by those who have governance responsibility. And staff don't always necessarily have governance responsibility. We respect that council and boards of directors have governance responsibility. But in moving forward on recommendation 3, we're specific about for an interim period of time, we need to take some actions to bring our housing services system together. And that includes coming up with ways that we can address some of the biggest challenges we're hearing in this community. We heard them tonight. We don't know what you're doing. We want you to get it together so that we understand it. And we also want you to come up with a plan so everyone knows what we're doing moving forward. The intention of doing that is that we have a staff person who can lead that process, act as the board, and then give direction to the organizations as well as our city staff.
Councillor Salee.
And my last question / comment through you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I missed it in the report, but what would the reporting look like? How frequent would that be? And I guess my question would be then to my colleagues, if it's not already captured, would they consider quarterly report outs of where we are with just everything? I'm not saying that I'm supporting the motion, I'm just asking those questions at this time.
Ms. Davisbeer?
Through the board, so the boards would operate the way that they've been operating with the existing board members in place. So they would meet monthly, and those processes would continue. We've recommended in the report that we would meet. We provide more information more frequently to council so that they're aware, not just in your annual shareholders meeting, that we report quarterly on the work that's being done to bring the housing system together.
Councillor Salee?
Yes, and to the chair. So either my colleagues want to make that a friendly amendment, not saying I'm going to support the motion. If they're not seeing it as a friendly, I would amend that to ask that there be quarterly reports. I know staff had mentioned that intent, but I feel like that would be an important part, but I'll leave it to the mover and seconder.
I'll ask a question, Ms. Davisbeer. If that's not clear in the recommendation, then that would be considered a friendly amendment. If Councillor Lewis would agree. So noted, thank you. Other comments or questions, Councillor? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks to all who spoke today for all the work that's been put into this. I recognize this is a huge issue for everyone, for council, for the staff of the HDC and for LMCH, for the boards, and for our staff at the City of London, and for the residents, and for Londoners at large. This comes certainly with a lot of concerns as I read through this, and it identifies a couple key concerns through the KPMG report. There was some discussion from Councillor Squire and Councillor Lewis about prospective budgetary asks that might be coming forward for operating budget on LTC and housing, and concerns about those. But at the outset of this term of council, and what I heard from most of you around the city as you went through your campaigns, were that these two areas were the priorities for this council and for this term. There's a reason for that. It's because we haven't funded them anywhere close to the level that they need to be funded at. In both circumstances, we are at the lowest amount of per capita funding of our peer groups. So yeah, if we're going to be able to fix this, there's going to be a dollar figure associated with that. And it's going to have a fairly significant impact on our operating budget over the years to come. So that brings me to the KPMG report, which has caused me a bit of concern because I've seen this as one of the more flawed reports that have been brought forward to us over the years. Methodologically, it really lacked in terms of peer benchmarking. Reading through it, I didn't get a sense of where London stood compared to its peers across the province in terms of funding specifically, but in terms of tenants housed, where we stood on a per capita basis of those who were involved with community housing. I really didn't get a picture of where we stood in a provincial context. I think it really overstated, and as I said at the last meeting, there's a trend line that talks about the vacancies, and that really the vacancies issue happened over the past year. But it shows this trend line over the past 5 years of increasing amounts. Take away this past year, the trend line is absolutely stable and is flat. This past year, there were issues, and we heard some of the reasons why that might have been. So it sounds like there's been a fair amount of work in that regard, but I think the other part is that it focused almost purely on that. In terms of maintenance and workload requests. As opposed to what does public housing and what do we need to do and what does tenant stability look like? And how do you keep tenants within the buildings? And on an ongoing basis, how do you support that? One of the biggest challenges we're seeing right now and we talk about is housing stabilization workers. So one is trying to find vacant units across the city in market rent, and we could do rent supports and things like that. But how do we support those who may have significant challenges in their lives to be able to be stable in their housing, to be able to continue to pay their rents, to be able to be successful in maintaining their units so that they can stay there and not be evicted. And I saw a lot of work during the strategic planning process of LMCH in trying to address those things, and I think that's incredibly important, and I think that went really unrecognized because it really focuses on one benchmark and that alone. And the third part that I saw really flawed in the KPMG report was this discussion about funding, because it didn't have any. We had the PricewaterhouseCoopers report last year. It made no reference to that. Made no reference to what the amount of funding might be required in order to be able to support this. It identified it, and I think it's unfortunate because I think both organizations and their boards are doing an incredible amount of work and really recognize the importance and urgency around what they're doing, but it's kind of scapegoated them, and I don't think that's fair, because really we're pointing the fingers at somebody else when really we need to look around this horseshoe and talk really frankly about how much money we put into housing within this city. So I'm not supportive of the recommendation. I'm not supportive of the motion that's on the floor right now. I'm going to vote against it. I'd urge you to as well, because I think there's some key interim steps that have been completely ignored in the recommendations. And I have a lot of concerns about that. I think in the first part, we absolutely need to be able to bring everything in. If the concern is around the amount of vacant housing and how quickly we turn over that inventory, we need to put every resource into that. Let's do that in the short term, but how sustainable is that? It's not sustainable without funding in the longer term. And the second, we need to create some clear benchmarks that council has in terms of expectations and what those are, and really help to coordinate a strategy prior to appointing a supervisor, because really in the large context of things, the nuclear option is to dissolve boards, place somebody in on an interim basis and take everything over. But I think there's a couple steps we can do in the meantime. Not to de-emphasize the importance of this, because I think it's one of our highest priorities of a council, and I think we need to do what's right, but I don't think this is the right path.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'll just work with some questions that I may have for staff. And one of the concerns I have here, speaking to the motion that's before us, is how does this translate to change as we move forward? I need to understand that. And stabilization, how is that stabilized? These questions I'm hoping staff can at least address here tonight. I think this is an important conversation that we need to have. I'm really looking forward to comments and debate from my colleagues here. And I know it's one of the most important things that we as a city have to consider when it comes to affordable housing, and I'm hoping you will give this time and energy and having that debate here at a committee is very important to me. So I'm hoping that you'll be very patient with me as I go through these questions that I have. The other question I have, following up on the stabilization, I know in the recommendation, it refers to how we need, I guess, a multi-phased approach and a governance review as we go forward. I've often heard from people that maybe we should combine these two authorities. So I think I need to understand if that's going to be part of a conversation moving forward. One of my concerns I have is around this timeline. When we talk about an interim option here, interim to me means a couple months. I think we're looking at 16, 18 months. That's a little bit of a concern for me. How interim is that? And how important it would be to have timelines. I appreciate Councillor Sully's motion, getting updates and reports. All those things are very important. Where are they going to be reported to? I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here. And before I start making a decision here, I need to have that conversation here with my colleagues. So if staff could respond to a couple of those questions through you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Dangersbeard, do you want to start us off, please?
Thank you, and through the chair, thank you for the questions. Your first question had to do with how do we move forward and how is this, I guess, change? How do we move forward to change? Over the last number of months, we've been working on the development of our homeless prevention and housing plan, the 5-year update. We'll bring that to council in December. We hear many things in these sessions. We've had 5 sessions, hundreds of people involved in delegations and providing information to us. We hear many of the things that I spoke about earlier tonight. Lack of housing, lack of clarity, 5,000 people on the wait list. There are 8,000 housing units in our community that we have responsibility for. There are 63 other housing providers. It's important for us to look globally at what we do in this community around housing. It is not, well, LMCH is a huge part of that. With 1/3 of those units, we need to look at the whole community in the housing piece that we do. And so if it isn't said specifically here in this report, it's intended to give us a sense that we have to look at all the services we provide in housing services with the support of council in doing that. We also have a huge homeless prevention program. We need to ensure that the homeless prevention work that we do, and that's an area that's just come into my service area over the last 6 months, is coordinated. We're just new in trying to gel as an organization. This provides us with a great opportunity to look at all the housing services that we do and create a new approach moving forward, a new plan moving forward. It won't be easy. We have lots of requests from stakeholders to address it, but we need to be respectful of the other 63 housing providers in this community who provide housing as well, and that's important, and they need to be part of this discussion too. You asked about stabilization. I think I just spoke to the reason about stabilization. We want to ensure that there's stability in the system. We have to continue to house people. We have to continue to fix existing units. We just came to council with a report on vacancies. While many of them were LMCH vacancies, there are also other vacancies in our community. We need to address those with housing providers as well. And we need to work with them around supports to individuals in their units, not just the ones in LMCH, but others as well. You asked about the multi-phase governance approach. Yes, I think when I mentioned earlier about the length of time to the end of December, it is not our intention, obviously, to hopefully take us that long. But I will remind you that reporting back to, you asked about who we would report back to. We would report back to the shareholder. You as council sit as the shareholder for both organizations. So that report back would come back to the shareholder as well. I think that answers majority of their questions. If I've missed something, I'm happy to answer something further.
Councillor Hopkins? Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were going to ask another question. I apologize. Councillor, now, Councillor Lewis, you've had some comments, so before I recognize you, I'm not sure if there's someone that has not yet been recognized that might like to speak, and then I'll come back to you if that's appropriate. Councillor Kayamaga.
Thank you. Through your chair, I just wanted to ask staff a question. Do you have any information on the vacancy rate of other providers, housing providers in our city, or is that something that we wouldn't have information on?
Ms. Dittersbeer?
Through the chair, we did provide that as part of the CAPS report that went to CAPS last week. I apologize for not having it in front of me, but the majority of the vacancies that we currently have in this community that require additional supports to be addressed are with LMCH. And as Mr. Brown indicated earlier, we have been discussing the mechanisms by which we support them in moving that forward. But I would say probably between 80 and 90% of them, of the number that exists in that report, and I apologize for not having it in front of me. It is in your council package for tomorrow night. We can certainly discuss it at that point in time too.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, I just was actually going to follow up on Councillor Hopkins' question with regard to reporting. Would it be staff's intent for the reporting on this to come through Community and Protective Services and then through Council, or through SPPC and then Council?
Ms. Dittersbeer.
Through the chair, I think it's probably fair to say that when we report on housing and homeless prevention issues, they come through CAPS. When we report, as we report out to the shareholder, that would come through SPPC. So it will be a combination through the chair to the councillor.
Thank you. Councillor Squire.
If you would allow, Mr. Chair, I want to be fair to the Housing Development Corporation, and when I was sort of suggesting that I'm not viewing them as a development corporation anymore, and just for background, some of the things I was hearing were that they're a resource, an advisor and an investor. Their job is to create sustainable long-term value in housing. So I did want to give them the chance to be fair since I made that statement, to maybe tell me why I'm wrong or if I'm sort of on the right page, because I'm not viewing them as a traditional developer in that they find a piece of property, find the financing, and build a building on it. And I just want to make sure I understand that. I think it's important to me if you would allow it.
I will allow it, and if Representative HDC would like to respond to that, or if you'd like a clarification from Councillor Squire, but by all means, please come to the microphone. Mr. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Councillor Squire. We are a developer. We can be a developer. We don't want to be just a developer. What we like to do is engage the development community to facilitate development. We are, I think, doing our best job when we have other people building, when we're supporting that building, when we're creating the business case that ensures that it's going to be viable over the long term, sustainable over the long term. But most importantly, if we were going to be just a developer, we would need a lot more of your money likely to do it. And our goal is to try and investigate and bring to the table as many sources of financing as we can possibly bring to the table. If we can have a developer build a building and enter into a contract with us, a service agreement that dedicates a certain number of those units to affordable housing, and if we can then approach CMHC and other sources of financing to help them build that building, and those sources may include the City of London, if we can then move to a toolkit that's made available by the City of London and get forgiveness of development charges, forgiveness of taxes, all of which allows that to come to market at the most competitive price we can possibly make it. So our job is twofold. We want to be a developer when we need to be a developer, and I would use the example of school sites again. There, we may well be a developer where we get that site to a certain point before we negotiate with other users who may do it. And we may take the affordable housing component of that, and we may move forward with it, and we may find a developer-builder partner to do that with us. That's the objective of the HDC, is we don't just want to deal with our city's funds. If we can get that, it allows us to deal immediately. So the way that we approached it is we thought on an annual basis, we had to ring the bell. We had to build a certain number of affordable units or make sure they get built. But at the same time as we're doing that, we're working to facilitate and to enable the addition of additional units across the city by working with strategic partners. In some cases, it would be people like Indwell, WellU. In other cases, it might be a specific developer. In other cases, it might be someone else again. But the key here was to create as many units as we could, make them as sustainable as possible. I mentioned earlier the 25, 35, 50-year agreements, make them as sustainable as possible, and develop a, if you will, a community of builders, of providers, of social services, all of whom understood what we were trying to accomplish and all of whom engaged in accomplishing exactly that. And I think it's important you not lose that. You know, one of the things that the HDC brought to the table was an independence from the city. And there's no question in my mind that certain people would deal with the HDC because it wasn't the city. They saw the city as being, quite frankly, bureaucratic at times, bound up in policies and rules. We could discuss with them the practicalities of getting from point A to point B and getting there quickly. So, you know, as much as we say, if this is what is good for housing in the broadest sense of the city, we will live with it. As I said earlier, do we think in the next 12 months the best governance for the HDC is what's been proposed? No, we don't. We don't see any hurry to deal with HDC. They're doing their job and they're doing it extremely well. And they will continue to do that job and continue to do it extremely well. However, there is a bigger picture item here that has been mentioned by several of the people here today. And if it's necessary to bring this to single governance to make that happen, then I think what we're saying is we understand what you're trying to accomplish. We don't necessarily agree with how you're getting there, but we understand where you're going, and we're not going to stand in the way of it. That's not why we took the job in the first place. We don't want to hold anything back. But we're going to entrust to housing at the city a legacy. That legacy is the people in that HDC. They are good people. They are smart people. They understand affordable housing, I'll tell you quite frankly, better than anybody else in this room. Okay? They know where they're going. They've got a strategic plan. They've got a path. They've got accountability. You know, there's been good work done. And if nothing else, that's the legacy that we leave in this room. Okay? Our request to you, don't drop the ball.
Thank you. Councillor Kayabaga.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I think I just, since we're still asking him, is it okay if I ask a question as well?
Council can do as it pleases. I will acknowledge, though, that we've had our delegations and the opportunities back and forth, but if you have a specific question, I would say, why not? Or pourquoi pas?
Thank you for the opportunity.
No, I think it's important. I think this is too critical an issue. We're not faffing about on this. We're going to get this right. Councillor Kayabaga.
So I just have a question for, through you, Chair, to Mr. Ross. I'm still trying to, like my colleague here said, still trying to understand the work that HDC does. And it's not that I have not searched to understand it. I think your staff would definitely tell you that I have connected with them on a number of occasions, trying to understand the work that you do and seeing how we can work together and be supportive. But I've always wondered, how come HDC is separate from LMHC? And where do you see the gap bridging where you can work together? We don't have to fund two separate corporations in this case. That's the first question. And the second question I had, I know that you guys work with private developers. And so is there a method in which you track the units that are put out in the community as affordable and whether they continue to be affordable and whether the mandate in which the developers walk in are respected and are continued and the need that's in the community versus I guess the housing that they've provided. So is there a method in which you guys are tracking these things, or is HDC, they just provide the funding through the criteria that the developers have to meet and then they're done with it?
Not
Mr. Ross, do you want to tackle that, sir?
Yeah, I'll tackle that, sir. Thank you. No, that, we don't remotely do that. We stay involved. First of all, when we deal with the developer, the first thing we do is we build a business case with that developer around whatever the development might be. And part of that business case is to make it rationalize itself financially, make sure that it's doing what we want it to do as far as affordable housing is concerned in our community, make sure it's doing what we want it to do if it's doing market rental housing in our community, and we enter into long-term service agreements with that developer. That's a condition under which they get finance and they get support. They may get some incentives from the city, and they have to abide by that over the term of that agreement. That agreement was developed with city legal. It's very comprehensive, and it makes sure that what we wanted to see happen, in fact, happened, and that it was sustainable over the term of that agreement. And so you can see if we have a 35 to 50-year agreement, we've created a very valuable stock of affordable housing that will exist for a long period of time. So there's nothing happen chance about what we were doing. And there should be nothing happen chance about what you're doing. My concern is under the new regime, I honestly think you're going to have more trouble dealing with developers than we did. And I hope that's not the case, but time will tell. And, it's a concern we discussed. And that's why I simply would ask that council be confident in what it's doing, that it will lead us ultimately collectively to a better place. Because we may take a wee step backward in the short term. I hope that's not the case, but I believe it's a possibility. The second thing, what the HDC does, we created inventory. We worked on the capital side of it. We don't operate the buildings for the most part. That's not our intention. We create the inventory. We create it through relationships with developers. We create it through relationships with NFPs, not-for-profits, like Indwell, like other people that we're dealing with. And what we do is we create that according to a relatively rigorous set of criteria that we know are going to lead to, as I said earlier, sustainability. It's going to lead to it serving the purpose that we wanted it to serve, but we don't run it. That's why we partner with people like Indwell, for example. We don't build it. That's why we partner with people like developers and we enter into agreements with them. So do we develop? Yes, we do, in the sense that we prepare. We're part of that preparation process that will allow us to bring units to market, to do other things that we can bring to market. Do we build? We may build certain units. There are units right now that are city-owned, that we have under development, that we would likely build. However, we would likely enter into a partnership agreement of some sort for people to actually run those buildings and move them forward for us. And that's where the other aspect that I mentioned is very important. When you do it that way, you can then reach out to even more partners, and they can layer on to what you're doing by providing additional expertise, providing additional money, and make it available for homelessness, for addiction to mental health, and for other needs. So that's what the concept I think works. The challenge to Sandra and her peers is to keep it working. But I think we leave, as I say, a very, very large legacy when we leave the 6 people that run HDC. They're extremely good at what they do.
Councillor Kayabak?
So I think, thank you for your answer, and I just want to tie in back to my first question with that information. So how come, or how, or why, you may choose whichever one you'd like to answer, are we not working? Why is it HDC not working with LMHC? Or how can we work with LMHC? Or I'm just wondering why we have those two services separately. Sorry.
Mr. Ross?
I'll answer that. In my humble opinion, again, you have to remember the HDC isn't even 3 years out of the blocks. Okay? It formed a business plan. It formed a business strategy. It created relationships. It's done several ventures. It's ahead of its strategic plan. Okay? We waited over a year to get a toolkit, to understand from the city what the incentives were that we could offer to developers to do affordable housing. That didn't happen overnight. Those are the kinds of things that we waited for. And quite frankly, I have to say that in my humble opinion, the HDC has done exactly what you asked it to do, and it's done it well. And that's why it's extremely important in my mind that it continue, because the value in the HDC is not what I've done or what the board's done. I think we prepared them well. The value of the HDC is going to be in what they do, and I think you'll be the beneficiaries of that.
Thank you. One more comment, please, Councillor Kaibach.
Thank you. So I think I'm just gonna turn this to staff, because I feel like my question hasn't been answered. My question is, can HDC and LMHC work together? And if that's the case, how can we merge? And I think someone had asked the same question earlier, if we can possibly merge, and what are the potential issues of merging the two together? If there aren't any, why aren't we doing it?
Ms. Davis-Beer?
Through the chair, LMCH and HDC already work together. They work in partnership with each other, and they work in partnership with my service area as well. Your question about could they be merged together, I have no doubt with council's direction through the shareholders agreement, we could be looking at that. I'm not going to take that away from this discussion. That's not the recommendation we put forward at this point in time. It could be something that might come back as part of the discussions about governance in this process moving forward.
Councillor Kaibach.
Thank you. So through you, Chair, again, just kind of going back on why is it not recommended at this moment? Is there a reason why it's not something that we can look at right now? Or maybe you're foreseeing things that I'm probably not foreseeing, or I don't know. I'm just curious to know why we can't get this going now.
Ms. Davis-Beer?
Certainly, thank you, and through the chair. I do want to be clear that we are looking at right now developing an approach to deal with the issues that are most concerning, whether that is to look at the vacancies that have been identified in LMCH, to look at all the other priorities that we have in our other housing areas. And one of the things that we're looking at is the development of affordable housing. One of the options that could be considered would be the governance model for affordable housing. You will know that we had affordable housing in-house within the city and delivered it in-house within the city up until HDC was developed. We made a direct and appropriate, I think at the time, decision to move it outside. The third-party report has indicated that there may be other considerations that you might want to look at as it relates to how affordable housing is delivered in this community.
Councillor Kaibach, any final comments, questions? Any other comments or questions? Councillor Squire.
My question is through you to staff. So if you have two volunteer boards who I think we all agree came to the table in good faith to get the job done, and then today we say you're both done, my response would be, if I was another person out in the community and you came to me and you said, "Whoa, would you like to sit on the London Community Housing Board?" You know what I would say is, I'm not going to jump on this board to possibly be told I don't have expertise and I get fired. How do you deal with that issue? I'm saying, in a year from now, saying to somebody out in the community, "Hey, join this board that we just fired."
Sorry, Councillor. Sorry, Ms. Davis-Beer.
Through the chair, a fair question. I think it's important for us to look at the issues as we've identified them currently, the ones that we need to resolve at this point in time. We're recommending that in order to do that and to support a broader piece about developing a plan for our housing system moving forward, that we change the governance structure. We appreciate the involvement of stakeholders in this community. We in no way are indicating that either board has developed or put in place any concerns that are of concern to us, save and except those that have been identified through the KPMG report. That being said, we would be looking, if we decided at some point in time with council's direction and council's approval to set up boards in the future, we would actively search for people to fill those board positions.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I heard from all of my colleagues. Thanks for the questions. On this topic, I think it's a really tough issue, and I came into the meeting not really knowing exactly what to do with this particular recommendation. I want to say, I guess off the top, that I mean, ultimately the responsibility for all these things lies with the council, right? So it's not our staff, and it's not the boards of the HDC or community housing or their staff. It all comes up to us on the council. And I think we have to take a collective responsibility for what is going wrong in the housing system. So I think everyone is acknowledging that there are some issues. There's things that could be improved. I think people have lots of different ideas about how to how to resolve some of those problems, how to meet some of those challenges. And I share some of the skepticism of some of my colleagues that, a governance change is going to make a huge difference or really get us a lot further ahead than where we are right now. In particular, I'm glad that Councillor Squire just raised it. I think that the future of having a community governed boards would be significantly damaged. Like the potential to have a really great functioning board of an independent organization in the future could be really damaged by how we handle this particular decision. And I can simultaneously recognize that the problems are significant and that we need to do things differently when it comes to both affordable housing and social housing, but also not be sure that this particular action is really the right thing to be doing. So I came in kind of skeptical. I remain skeptical that this is really the right thing to do. And so I would say to my colleagues that perhaps we shouldn't do it. I think there are some things that are sort of urgent, and I would say most of those urgent things are related to Alena Middlesex community housing, as far as I can tell from all the reports and information that I've received and read. That's where the urgency it lies. I think with the Housing Development Corporation, I do recognize that they are relatively new. In preparing for this meeting, I went back and read some of the stuff from 2015, and one of the slides said what the Housing Development Corporation is not. And it said, it is not a fully funded thing that will develop a lot more units of affordable housing. It was like, it was in pretty big type. Like it was very clear that it was not going to lead to dramatically more numbers of units of affordable housing in the short term, right? And that funding and getting all the funding leveraged and into the organization in the future was going to be key to actually getting those units created. I think in terms of the lengthening of the agreements, just to speak briefly about the Housing Development Corporation, that has been a significant improvement. We never had 50-year agreements or 35-year agreements. That just wasn't unheard of. And I think that is a significant improvement that we see in London that you don't see in other communities, and a good example for the rest of the province. I think on Middlesex community housing, the thing I personally want to take some responsibility for is that we have underfunded, Councillor Turner has mentioned this, through the various budgets that we've dealt with the exception of the small, $258,000 increase that we dealt with sort of mid multi-year budget. We really have not put a lot of extra resources into Alena Middlesex community housing, and most of those additional resources have been gobbled up by things like the price of utilities has gone up, right? So it's not really delivering more human resources. It's not really delivering more resources to repair units, which is one of many issues we've sort of focused on in the discussion. So I think we're gonna have to do something on that front. I do think more resources, both human and financial, are gonna be necessary because the problems are quite significant. I think we have to think of how we can do that because, increasing the property tax levy to pay for all these things, I do think there's some sustainability problems with that. So how are we gonna actually do that in the multi-year budget? We're in the fortunate position where we have, a fair amount of federal funding for housing on the table. And I'm very concerned that making big changes in housing while we have these opportunities to actually deliver things differently could have a kind of paralyzing effect. So we have a problem and then we try and fix it with governance changes, and then it just paralyzes things and demoralizes people, and results get worse rather than better. I'm really encouraged by what I heard from Mr. Brown when he stood there and he talked about what it feels like to be constantly feeling like you're failing the people who you're supposed to be delivering for. I think taking responsibility like that is really important in the leader of an organization, and I wanted to say that must have been a tough thing for him to do, and I think it speaks well to his character. I think we need to look at, just as an example of some things we need to be dealing with differently, more regular reporting into the council, either at the committee level through CAPS or here at SPPC sitting as the shareholder, because it's so important and we really are not spending a lot of our time talking about it. And I think we need to change that. So in addition to whatever governance changes do or don't happen, I think we need to talk about how we're going to do that. I think we need to look at using the approach we take with affordable housing projects, which is change how they're taxed so that they get taxed at the residential rate for the Middlesex community housing buildings. Property taxes are about half of their budget. we're taxing them at the highest rate possible. It doesn't have to be like that, and we could tax them at a lower rate. That would probably save $2.5 million, right? But we'd have to make some adjustments. You know, that program is for affordable housing projects. You'll see those bylaws come forward property by property where we make an adjustment and we say we're gonna exempt part of this building from taxation. We might have to amend our own municipal facilities bylaw to make it clear that that kind of thing is eligible. But I think it's possible, and it's something that could be done over time, maybe not all at once, but we could do it over time. And it would give them a bit of breathing room and make some more, lower their operating costs without having to increase the overall tax levy, right? We're just changing who's paying the taxes and what the rate is gonna be for those buildings, not increasing the property tax levy. So I think that those are things we have to talk about. And at this point, I think, you know, clearing out both boards and replacing them with one person, I don't think that's the right way to go. I'm not gonna support that at this point. Not to say that we couldn't be making changes to the boards, right? I do think having another counselor, which we've talked about a bunch of times, I think putting some additional people on there would be helpful. There's nothing stopping any of us from going to these board meetings and seeing what's going on firsthand. You know, these are boards and commissions, people drop into these meetings all the time. So, you know, I'm not gonna support this particular change. I am gonna bring up a separate motion about our staff reporting back about whether we can use the municipal facilities bylaw and those, that approach sort of property by property to free up some operating expense for Middlesex Community Housing after this motion is dealt with.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to make a few comments here. I want to say, when I first read the KPMG report, I knew that we needed to change the way we do affordable housing in London, without a doubt. The options that are being presented here in this recommendation, I came in not knowing where I was going to go. I wanted to hear from my colleagues about their concerns, their comments, hearing from the delegations. And I've learned a few things. One of the things I've learned is that I do know staff need to have some kind of an analysis and an understanding how we do affordable housing with HDC and with LMCH. That's important as we go through the affordable housing strategy that they're undertaking. I also heard that we need to, maybe there's a possibility of coordinating, having enough strategy. Are there other options available to us other than these three? I think we need to explore them because it is important that we do that. And I'm not 100% convinced that this option is the right way forward. I understand it. I understand the need for it. The changes are important, but I'm not completely convinced. I'm hoping that we could have further conversations about reporting and how we are making the changes, understanding the funding. There's so much to understand and know, and I'm not convinced that this is the right way forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing further comments from my colleagues.
Thank you. Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Your Worship. I usually take that as my cue from Councillor Hopkins is if you haven't spoke up yet, please speak up and share your thoughts on this. Because it is important that we all have an equal voice around this horseshoe, that we understand where everyone's coming from and what their concerns are. I'll start with the question to staff through you, Mr. Chair, of what is the eviction rate if you know them at the properties that we're asking, well, obviously, people to leave?
Ms. Datersbeer, would you have that number?
Through the chair, I do not have that number. I could certainly ask the organization who's upstairs above us to answer that question if council wanted to indulge that, but that they would have the number, LMCH would have that number. And they might not, so I may have just set them up in that regard.
Would, Mr. Brown, would you like to take that question, please?
Yep. Through the chair, very briefly, it's under 2%.
Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you for indulging me in that and having an answer. I want to thank everyone here for this open conversation tonight. It's certainly not an easy conversation. And in order to find a path forward, we need to be having these conversations. I appreciate the board and the work that they've done. Certainly know members of that board, and I consider them friends. And I would never be one to assume if you had lived experience, current or past, that it would make you unqualified to serve on the boards. It's one of the best people to have around, in my opinion. And I do find it odd staying on this side of the conversation, having past experience myself. So I will own that in this space as we move forward. My concern is everyone's put forward the main point of it's the people we're trying to serve that need to come first. And while being mindful of the feelings of the people on the boards, that's always my first consideration. And depending on what conversation we might make tonight and what decisions come out, it might make it harder to have boards filled going forward. So whatever we do, this is a pivotal point in housing. We need to make sure that we don't squander it, we don't waste it, that we have a clear path forward of what regeneration is going to look like, what supportive housing is going to do, which is why I was asking what the eviction rate is of some people who need a lot of extra support and help, that it's just not a revolving door from one wait list to the next, that we actually serve people and take care of them. And at the same time, recognizing we can't begin to serve these people unless we get them off the streets and into these units. So for me, the fastest way forward to get these people into housing is a priority, and getting these units move-in ready, work orders done, and compliance. I do have fears that we just look for more funding and more frequent reporting, that isn't actually addressing the problem, that we need the appropriate staff and oversight to do this. And once again, certainly nothing against the boards or who's on them or the people serving. I think they're wonderful. It really is. And we put them there. Council appointed the board. So as it's already said, it's on us, and making sure that we make the best of this opportunity before us. And I am inclined to support option number 3 of getting our house in order and having those conversations, that as we have them, it's us and staff, and us pushing staff hard and them pushing us back of clear direction and find the path forward.
Thank you. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I find that we always talk about affordable housing. It sort of dominates the conversation. And I know some people are using affordable housing as a term that means everything, but it doesn't. And I recognize we are here tonight to talk about both affordable and social housing, but I want to talk specifically about the people that are on the wait list for social housing. Generally, the people that we house through LMCH and other providers are people that can't afford affordable housing. So I'm wondering through you, Mr. Mayor, to staff, and perhaps they might not have this information, but I'm hopeful. Do you know of the people on the wait list, and recognizing that this wait list is thousands of people, but most people on this list may already be housed, just may not be adequately housed, or maybe couch surfing or living with residents, or maybe in affordable housing that they can't really afford. And they're paying, a great percentage of their monthly income for this housing while they wait for housing that they actually can afford. So I'm wondering if staff knows how big a chunk of the number of people on the wait list are actually in affordable housing. And I ask that because there's a shortage of social housing, there's a shortage of affordable housing. Could we free up some capacity in the affordable housing by actually getting people housed that should be housed in LMCH buildings or other provider buildings.
Ms. Davisbear?
Through the chair, I think if I understand your question, it's the number of people who live in affordable housing units that would pay 80% of the average market rent. How many of those would actually benefit from being in a place where they paid a rent geared to their income, so up to 30% of their income towards rent? Did I get that right? We don't have that number with respect to how many people who are in an affordable housing situation might actually be concurrently on the wait list. I will say to you, though, and we do know this, that many of the people who are on the wait list are housed. Whether they're in the private sector, I don't know about the specific number, but they could be in affordable housing as well. The people that are homeless are not necessarily on that list. We would not want them to be on that list. Those people who have experienced violence because of a spousal relationship will be on that list, but they have priority. We can certainly come back to you with that number, and I'm going to endeavor to do that. But at this point in time, I would say to you that probably the majority of people on the list are housed, because we try very hard to work with those who are either urgently in need of housing or imminently homeless, and through other mechanisms, including our homeless prevention system.
Councillor Cassidy?
Oh, thank you. And I have another question through you, Mr. Mayor. As part of the discussion tonight, Ms. Datersbeer mentioned about a coordinated approach, and it was in the the KPMG report as well, about the homeless prevention division and the housing division and LMCH and HDC, and having all of these units together in a more coordinated approach. I wonder through you if I could just get a clear understanding of what a coordinated approach would mean with all four of those players.
Ms. Davisbear?
Through the chair, clearly at this point in time, the homeless prevention work that we do through the city and in partnership with the partners in our community is delivered by the city, as is the responsibility for the administration of affordable housing, or I should say social housing, which does include LMCH as well. We actually have a relationship, a service manager relationship, but LMCH sits as a standalone organization. We had the responsibility for affordable housing, but I mentioned earlier, we moved that into a separate standalone organization to highlight the need for additional housing in this community. I would see that moving forward, we would continue to build on the relationships we have currently. It may allow, though, with civic administration or council delivering the governance structure, to be able to be more direct as opposed to going through outside boards. I'm not suggesting that outside boards aren't effective. I'm just saying that there's an opportunity, if you make it a city-led and city-supported governance structure, that there may be able to be more direct direction on behalf of the city in developing a plan that's more collaborative and more coordinated.
Councillor Cassidy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I do share the trepidation that's been identified, I know, by the deputy mayor, I think another councillor, I can't remember who, about the ability of the city to attract board members going into the future if we were to disband both boards the way that the recommendation is described. And I also recognize, as Mr. Brown mentioned, this was an inherited problem. This isn't a brand new problem. The problems that are going on right now are not new. And I wanted to highlight as well in the staff report that staff commend both boards for the hard work and the passion and the care in serving on these boards and in the work that they've done. And I share that. This is a very difficult situation that we're in. I wonder through you, Mr. Mayor, is there a way to not disband the boards and yet have this more direct approach? Is there some kind of a hybrid possibility where civic administration can play a much more direct role in collaboration with existing boards and the board structure?
Ms. Datersbeer, I'm not sure if that's a question for you, but do you want to try to tackle that?
Thank you. Through the chair, my answer is yes. I'll leave it at that. So definitely, I think we provided you with 3 options to consider. We also indicated in the report that there are many other options to consider. You could, as a shareholder, direct both organizations to act in a certain way. That's a possibility under your shareholder declarations and your shareholder agreement. I'm not going to not tell you that. That's certainly advice I could give you. Similarly so, we can work together, and we do work well together. We do need to address some of the challenges we hear in our community about who does what. Whether we exist as 4 or 3 separate entities, or one entity, or a combination or a modified version thereof, we have work to do, irrespective of what decision you make tonight.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I'll start off with, it's kind of an impossible situation for us, because we're not going to know if we make the right decision. No matter what decision we make, we're probably going to get criticized for it, because if we don't do anything and things don't improve, then we're going to say we should have acted. And if we do something and things don't improve, we're going to say, why did you mess around with, the plans that were in place? So I think my colleagues can take comfort in that there really isn't a right answer here. It's a very difficult situation, but what is very clear is that the process that we have followed, and there's some path dependency in this through a number of actions that are mostly within our control, but probably unintended, is that we put ourselves in a situation where we've really done some damage to the way that members of our boards are feeling right now. And I know people talked about the ability to recruit. I think we have some challenges with the position that we put our boards and staff in already, irrespective of the decision we made. We heard from LMCH that there's a lot of sadness with the board because of the approach. And I will agree with them that I'm not a big fan of the methodology that KPMG used to assess the governance. I think that there's some legitimate criticisms that the board members have made about them being assessed in the way that they thought that they were being assessed, and maybe not given the opportunity to perform, or at least share their perspective. So for me, irrespective of what you decide, I hope that there's a place for the existing board members in any organization moving forward, through whatever organization might exist. And I think that's key, is that we don't know where this will lead, and we don't know the structure, and we don't know who we will. But I will say, I don't think any councillor would disagree that there's exceptionally talented people on these boards and staffing these organizations who definitely need to play a role in housing in our city in the future. But, and this is the tricky spot, what we have is we've led ourselves to a staff recommendation that the public is aware of, that we're discussing. We've got an outside report, and we have Ms. Datersbear and Ms. Barbone, signing a recommendation. And there are a couple of individuals who don't often get things wrong, and who I trust greatly with their decision making. So I tend to lead towards their guidance when, I don't know if there's a win here, right? There's a lot of situations, and I do like the concerns that colleagues have raised about the reporting and the structures, and I would be open to other options, but there aren't a bunch of other options before us today. And I think the one thing that is going to be difficult, and the one thing we will get criticized for, is continuing to not make a decision on this. We've already asked for a review, and then we got a review back, and then we, deferred to this meeting, and now maybe we'll move forward with other options. We're not making changes here, and I feel like we should be doing something. So at this point, I think I'm going to support, I will support the mayor's recommendation. I'm interested in what alternatives could come out of the structure of the process, but I think we need to make absolutely clear that the individuals involved in these organizations are not the ones at fault. Like, we have an issue in the city that we all carry responsibility for, as do the federal and provincial governments, for the way that they support municipalities and the amount of funding that's provided to us. So again, I don't think there's a right decision here. And so I'm going to base my decision on the trust of our staff and the recommendations they've moved forward. And I certainly will say, I know that no one is going to be happy. I'm going to get calls no matter what decision I make. And that's just because of the path we've gone through. People feel very upset about the way that they were treated through this process, and it's not fair. But at the end of the day, we have to make some decision here. And I just wanted to make very clear that I certainly, in my vote, I respect every single person involved in housing. I think they're all passionate. I think they're all exceptionally talented. But I have to deal with a motion that's before us on the recommendation of our staff, and I think we need to do something. And again, I will accept the criticism if this is not the right path at the time, but that's our job as counselors. But so I'm going to vote today, and I'll still listen to colleagues who haven't spoken yet, though.
Councillor Squire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I obviously have to make a decision at some point in time, and I think I have. So the first thing I want to say is I have to say, and this is what you're feeling. You're learning really, you're feeling what we feel as counselors every single day on every single issue. We're criticized, attacked, and we're used to it. So we get it all the time. But one of the byproducts when people perceive that you're not doing your job is they abuse us a lot more than they abuse you about that. They blame us for things not being done. And I will admit to a certain amount of concern that council has been put in this position, whether it's justified or not, because of areas that we don't have direct control over. I get in enough trouble myself on the things I do without getting in trouble for things I don't really have a lot of control about. So I hope you keep that in mind in the future, that you have a huge responsibility. And if you take a little heat for that responsibility, that's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. I'm sorry, but you better get used to it, or I don't necessarily think you should be sitting on boards, because you're on a public board and people are going to look at what you do and they're going to make judgments. It's the way it goes. So I'm sorry about that, but it does happen that way. I just want to say that I think I just have a huge difficulty putting London Middlesex Community Housing and the the Housing Development Corporation in the same bucket and saying they're the same thing. We're going to do the same thing with both of them. I think that's very, very difficult, which is why I can't support a motion that treats them both the same. So I want to talk about the Housing Development Corporation first, and I want to tell you that I am not happy with you. I think you have some serious flaws in the way you do things. The number one flaw you have is your communication. I'm going to tell you tonight, until Mr. Ross stood up and explained what you do and how you do it, that wasn't what I understood. The other thing is, I can tell you that I don't invite people to meetings where someone wants help. The staff member comes and talks for like 45 minutes straight, and by the end of it, none of us understand what anybody's talking about. And I'm telling you that's what happens when I do that. You have to be able to explain what you do and the benefit you're providing to the City of London, or you shouldn't exist. You just shouldn't. And I think you have to do a much better job of that. The other thing is, I think it would be well served to go back and if you survive this, not to say, oh, we're great, we were great, we survived. I don't think that's how I feel. I feel you have a lot of improving to do. I think you have to do a lot better, explaining to people what you do and what you are providing to the City of London. Because KPMG ended up judging you on something that really you say you're not really responsible for. And you can say that's because they're bad people, but I think part of it has to do with your inability to communicate what you're doing. Sorry, but that's how I feel. So I hope you don't go back and say status quo, and I hope you speak to your staff about being better communicators, being better with counselors. I've had very few meetings with people from your organization where things have been explained to me, and I'm being blunt, but that's the way it is. So I think you should continue to exist, but I think you have to do a better job. London Middlesex Community Housing would be different for me, and I'm telling you why. I have no animus towards them, but I think the financial situation with regard to London Middlesex Community Housing is of such an extent and is so huge in terms of the amount of money that you need that it has to be more closely integrated with the City of London. Am I happy that people are getting rid of the entire board? No, but I absolutely believe that there has to be better integration, because I'm disappointed that over the 4 or 5 years I've been here, the infrastructure gap has increased greatly. And now you're coming to us with a solution, and I beg to differ. I don't think that has been presented to us earlier. So I would support half of this resolution, which reluctantly, but I can't support it with Housing Development Corporation. But again, I don't think any councillor is up here thrilled that they have to answer about affordable housing issues that are your files, not our files.
Thank you. Before I recognize Councillor Turner, and I know we've had a very fulsome dialogue around this issue, there is a motion on the floor. I'm also recognizing the time, and I'm going to have Councillor Turner speak. If it's the will of council, we can, there's a motion on the floor that is for consideration. If that passes, so be it. If it does not, then I'm going to suggest straight away that we take our break. By the way, it's snacks. I lied to council, misled you actually. It's not dinner, it's snacks. So that means we would have a very brief break and come back to the horseshoe. So with that and that understanding, if we're comfortable, Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to be really brief, Councillor Cassidy asked a question about what the options were if we wanted to maintain the boards and not dismiss them and try to achieve the same result. One of those is an accountability agreement, putting in clear benchmarks and deliverables that we would expect to see over a period of time. Those would need to be developed, and I think they're well underway. They've been identified clearly by LMCH and by staff in their reports. We would put those in place and tie the future associated with performance against those benchmarks.
Okay, any other formal comments or questions? Perhaps what I'd like now to do then, if I may, there is a motion seconded on the floor. We'll see the result of this and take whatever actions are appropriate. So with the permission of council, I'd like to turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Councillor Cassidy? Closing the vote, and the motion passes 7-6.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you all for your participation tonight. I'm not aware of any, oh, excuse me. Deputy Mayor Helmer, you said that there was something you were looking to present. I apologize. Can we, I'm mindful of timing because I did indicate that following the vote, we would take a brief break. I'm at the pleasure of our colleagues. Why don't we do that, please? I know that if we're going to get into another discussion, I think it's only appropriate. So I'd like to have a motion to recess, please, temporarily. Do I need to do that? Brief recess for something here. Yes, Councillor Kaibaga.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wondered if we could just hear what Deputy Mayor has to say before we go on, so that we don't have to recess and come back. I don't know.
May I say, again, the will of council, but if it's extended discussion, I think it's only appropriate that we have a brief break. But Deputy Mayor, do you want to add something to this and bring some elucidation to the issue?
Yeah, so as I suggested in my earlier comments about the recommendation from the staff, I wanted to suggest a part D, which would be to have our staff report back on the feasibility of taking the same approach we do with affordable housing developments, which is to tax them at the residential rate. That's something that's covered by the Municipal Housing Facilities Bylaw. There might need to be some amendments. So my suggestion is just to have the staff report back on whether that's possible. Hopefully that's not something that's going to require a whole lot of discussion, but I think it's a good idea worth investigating. And I would like to suggest that as a part D.
Part D, where I don't know that we're talking about a friendly amendment because it's already been passed. So I think as a result of that, is that a motion you're moving as part D then, Deputy Mayor? Seconded by Councillor Lewis as part D. Any comments or questions about that? Then let's turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-0.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm not aware of any other deferred matters or additional business. Look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Kayabага. Let's turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-0.
Colleagues, there are a few snacks at the side here, but thank you very much for your for this special strategic priorities and plan and policy committee meeting. And thank you to the gallery for your participation. What you said tonight is helpful.